Hey everybody, it's Mike Belcito, co-founder of Product Collective, and we're back for another industry interview. Thank you so much for being here. And I am super excited for this interview today for a few reasons. One, this is definitely a topic that for me as a product person has been important. A couple of the products that I've worked on in the past, this is totally relevant. You know, products that we had were consumer-facing products, and they needed to be, sticky. They needed to be things that people kept coming back to. So I remember reading Nir's book, and it was super helpful. But also, Nir was one of the very first speakers at Industry back in 2015. So he goes way back as it relates to Industry and what we're up to here at Product Collective. So I'm going to you could already see Nir, but I'm gonna go and introduce Nir in just a second. Before I do, I want to just let a reminder to everybody who's here for the first time. Maybe this is the very first industry interview you've ever attended. First off, thank you for being here, but we do these pretty often. Usually it's the first and third Wednesday of every month. And pretty simple, we try to find product leaders that are up for chatting with us here, and gives all of you an opportunity to ask questions that might be on your mind as well. In fact, here there's an ask a question section. You might see that. Also a chat. Definitely, use the chat to introduce yourself, all of that. But if you have a question for our guest today, use the ask a question section. I'm going to be monitoring that throughout. So definitely check that out. I would love to ask your questions as well as mine. Also, there are a few other industry interviews coming up. There's one that's already on the site, and you can check that out. There's also one that we will be adding really soon with John Zaratsky, who's one of the co-authors of the book Sprint. So that's actually coming up in September. So keep an eye out for that. And then finally, we have our conference in the fall. Industry takes place in October 1st through the 3rd. But I'm pretty pumped that we just announced last week BJ Novak will be joining the lineup. So some of you might know BJ Novak as the youngest vice president of Dunder Mifflin. That was his character anyway on The Office. He was a writer and actor on The Office. He also was a best-selling author, a children's author. In fact, I learned that my 5-year-old son knew who he was, well before I mentioned him at home. So I thought that was pretty cool. But BJ will be talking about some of the products he's worked on. Believe it or not, actually software products. He has worked on some of those, but TV scripts and books and the processes that he goes through, it might not be all that different than what you go through as a software product person. So you might be surprised. So maybe you could join us in Cleveland for that. There's a promo code you could use. I made it just for today, Habit, and you'd save a couple $100 off of your pass. We're going to make that available for the next week, so you can check that out. But with all of that out of the way, I do want to say hello to Nir Eyal. How's it going, Nir?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me today.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us. Again, it's, I really enjoyed reading your book. It's been out for a while. When did it first come out again? Can you remind me?
Late 2014.
Yeah, so definitely, been out for a few years, but we had the chance to bring you out to Cleveland, Ohio for Industry, actually the very first Industry back in 2015. But ever since then, I've continued to go back and reread your book Hooked a couple of times, listen to it, the audio version. It's definitely been something that, I've revisited several times. And I thought that this would be a really cool opportunity, because I bet there's several other product people, probably not just several, probably the couple hundred product people that are joining us today where they're in the same boat. So again, thank you very much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure. This is great. This is my favorite part, actually. So there's been so much happening in the habit forming product space, and there's been a lot of development since I wrote the book that I'm very eager to talk about. And I love questions. This is my favorite part. When I give a presentation, I'm happy to kind of give a run through of the Hook model and what I put in the book. But I would love to go beyond what I put in the book and kind of see if we could tackle some folks' engagement challenges when it comes to building habit forming products.
I would love that. I would love that. And like I said, hopefully many of the questions today are coming from the audience and not me. But I do want to start off maybe with just for folks that.
One thing real quick before we get into the questions. If we don't get to your question today, you can go to my website, nirandfar.com. I actually do office hours every single week. I kept getting asked these questions about, hey, what do you think about my hook and how can I make my product more habit forming? If we don't get to yours today, because we only have about a half an hour, on my website, there's a little tab that says schedule time with me. I book time with people every week in 15-minute increments. I do these office hours for an hour a week. feel free to book some time there if we don't get to you today.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
And I by the way, I put the URL right in the chat for everybody too.
All right, perfect.
Cool. So, you know, I wanted to, for a lot of the people that are joining us, I would assume they are already familiar with Hooked, maybe even already read through Hooked, but it might have been a while. So I just thought maybe just to start things off, if you wouldn't mind just really, you know, kind of giving us a quick refresher on the premise and sort of the background for, you know, why you wrote Hooked in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked at the intersection of gaming and advertising for several years. At the intersection of these two industries, I saw a lot of companies come and go, and I didn't really understand why some worked and why some didn't. So I got started back in 2017 or 2007, back when apps wasn't mobile apps. Apps were Facebook apps, and the Facebook ecosystem back then was a really interesting time to test out many of these theories around how consumer psychology can change people's behaviors. And so I saw a lot of companies kind of, you know, trying out these techniques, and some of them would do incredibly well, and then others would fall on their face. And so I really wanted to understand and codify why this was happening. And so when my last company was acquired, I had some time on my hands, and I was looking for a guidebook on how to do this. How do we build the kind of products that bring people back? And the reason why I thought this was so important is because I had an investment hypothesis around how I would invest my human capital, which said that basically, you know, my view of the future was that as people went from desktop to laptop to mobile devices to wearable devices and now audible devices like Amazon Alexa, the Amazon Echo, and Microsoft Cortana and Siri, that habits become more and more important, because as the real estate shrinks, as there's a less place to trigger people with messages, with what I call an external trigger, and you have to be triggered yourself. You have to form a habit. So the smaller the interface gets, the more important habits become. And I think that that's been epitomized when you think about the voice interface with products like the Amazon Echo, where if you don't remember what to tell Alexa to do, she won't do it for you. And just the same way that goes with our mobile devices, if you don't exist on the home screen of someone's phone, if they don't remember that you exist, you might as well not even exist. So habits become increasingly important when it comes to mobile devices, and then of course to any device, any interface where the screen real estate shrinks. So that's why I wrote the book. I frankly didn't find a book that existed that taught me how to do this, and so I sought out to write it myself.
That's great. And I want to come back to, you know, you mentioned things like Amazon Alexa. That when you wrote the book, I don't even know if like Amazon Echo was out quite yet. But there's probably been
nowhere near.
The world's changed a little bit in the last year.
Right, but what was clear even back then is that devices would become more ubiquitous, transmission speeds would become faster, and access to these devices would increase. So as devices became, you know, things that are, and I think that's my hypothesis for the year to come, our devices will just be embedded into our day-to-day lives. And I think the Amazon Echo is a good example of that. You know, we'll have computing devices and these digital interfaces all over the place, and it'll be up to us and the app maker to create those habits that remind us to use these products.
Yeah, it is a quick aside. Sometimes that habit, my 5-year-old yesterday just out of nowhere said, Alexa, order a fidget spinner. And then all of a sudden, like, fidget spinner ordered, and you had to go and cancel it. So sometimes those habits are really instilled, even in the young ones.
The funny thing is my daughter now only talks to Alexa with the robot voice. So she'll say, Alexa, play me some music. So she's learned, because that's how Alexa talks to her. That's how she talks back to Alexa.
That's funny. Well, so going back to the hook, you know, I know there's a model, sort of this 4-step model. And again, some of us might remember that, but others might need a refresher. Would you mind even just giving us a quick refresher on those 4 steps? I feel like that's a big part of the book.
Sure. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand what is it about forming products? What is it about the best of breed companies out there in our industry that are so good at changing consumer habits? What is it that Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and WhatsApp and even in the enterprise space, companies like GitHub and Slack and Salesforce, what is it that they do in the design of their products to keep people coming back on their own? And so what I found in my research was that they all use these 4 basic steps that I dub the hooked model. And the hooked model basically has these 4 basic steps. It starts with a trigger. There are 2 types of triggers. We have internal triggers and external triggers. We'll get back to those internal triggers in a second, but let's start with the external triggers. External triggers are something in our environment that tell us what to do next. So it can be a ping, a ding, a ring, anything in your environment that gives you some piece of information for what to do next. So let's take Facebook. I think that's a very habit-forming product. I think a lot of people would agree that's a product that sometimes can turn from a habit to be a healthy behavior, sometimes for some folks even an addiction where they overuse the product. So the trigger would be the external notification, right? It's something over email, something over your device that says, hey, something just happened on Facebook, check it out. That's an example of an external trigger. The next phase of the hook is the action phase. The action phase is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a. In the case of Facebook, it's just opening the app and scrolling the feed. On YouTube, it's pushing the play button. On Google, it's a quick search. The simplest thing that I can do to get my need met. Then the third step of the hook is the variable reward phase. Now, the reward phase is where the user's itch is scratched, where they get what they came for. And when it comes to rewards, it's important that they're not just the reward. It's not just satisfying the user's need. What we also find with habit-forming products is that there's also some element of variability, some form of uncertainty. And this comes out of the work of B.F. Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner found that in his experiment, he took these pigs, he put them in a little box, he gave them a disc to peck at, and every time they pecked at the disc, they would receive a little reward, a little food pellet. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased when the reward was given on a variable schedule as opposed to a fixed schedule of reinforcement. So we see variable rewards in all sorts of things that we find interesting and engaging. If you think about romance, what makes a romantic relationship interesting? What makes slot machines something that we like to play? What makes sports interesting? What makes the news something that we want to engage with? And of course, why do we keep scrolling our news feeds? It's all about these variable rewards, searching and searching for this next bit of information. And then finally, and perhaps the most important of the 4 steps of the hook, is the last step, which is called the investment phase. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product in anticipation of some kind of future benefit, some kind of long-term reward. And so investment can take the form of data, content, followers, and reputation. All of these things that as I do, I'm increasing the value of the product with time. Now that's amazing. Think about it. That's never been done in the history of production of products. We've never had a time when we are co-creating in real time these products and services. So in the case of Facebook, right after I've opened the app, I've started scrolling my feed. Now that's the variable reward phase. The investment phase is every time I like something, comment, friend somebody, post something. All of these things are building the product for me in real data I'm giving the company, and it's improving it with use. Now, through successive cycles through these hooks, what we find is that we no longer need the external trigger at all. People become triggered from what's called an internal trigger is a negative emotional state. It's a state of discomfort that we seek to escape. Now, the way the brain gets us to act, all of our actions, is by this source of discomfort. We used to think in psychology that people act to gain pleasure and avoid pain. It came from Freud. Now we know that's not true. That neurologically speaking, it's actually pain all the way down. Everything we desire, everything we want is driven by a static process. So for example, when you feel cold, you put on a coat. When you feel warm, you take the coat off. When you feel hunger pangs, you eat. And when you feel stuffed and it's not comfortable to eat more, you stop eating. So the same goes for our products. It's very important that you know if you want to build a great product or service, it has to cater to a need. It has to cater to their pain points, not just on a functional level, but on a psychological level. So it's very important you understand those internal triggers, because your job as someone who's building a habit-forming product, the beauty of what we do in this industry, the reason I love being in this space and I believe in it so much, is because we get to solve people's problems. But in order to do that, you have to understand what their pain points are. So the very first step is where I ended. It's understanding what is the sufficient frequency that we are going to attach our product's use to. Then we do the trigger, and then we do the action, the reward, and the investment, and then the hook continues. And of course, the hope is we don't want to hook people to just various things or time wasters. What we want to do is to help them form healthy habits, right? Get them exercising more, saving money, connecting with friends and family, being more efficient at work. These are all behaviors that we can turn into habits, into healthy habits, if people would only use our product. So that's why I do what I do. I don't want to get people hooked to video games and social networks. That's boring. What I want to do, why can't we use the same exact techniques in psychology to get people hooked to healthy habits that improve their lives?
Yeah, that's great. And everything that you were saying, those 4 steps, I was thinking of my own personal experiences. With me, it's less Facebook, although I'm there too, but like more on Twitter. And every single one of those steps, you're right on. And even those triggers that happen after the fact, like when I'm out of the app, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if I have any, are there any app notifications that I should be looking at? And it brings me back there. So it's totally relevant. I'm curious though, it seems simple. Like the way you explained it was pretty succinct, and that sort of captured everything. But I also imagine that there are plenty of companies, plenty of products that get it wrong. Like even with the best intentions, even having read your book, listened to your talks, I'm curious, why is that? Why do you think people do get it wrong if the concept is relatively simple and easy to understand?
Yeah, so there's no one area that people consistently get wrong. It really depends on the context of that company. So it used to be for many years, the thing that everybody or the most people got wrong was believe that this worked, right? They thought that these kids in Silicon Valley, they somehow just got lucky, right? They stumbled onto these products, and now millions of people, now billions of people just use them. And that's changed. Now I think people are starting to realize that good design must incorporate product psychology. We have to understand people click, what makes people tick in order to understand what makes them click. And so that's now become, I think, more of an industry practice. I think the biggest problem used to be not even using this tool in the first place. Now I see that the problem is kind of shifting into how do we incorporate, how do we get everybody on board to think about these deeper user needs? So we've crossed a big hump. I think there's still a far way to go. I think recently there's been a lot of talk around some companies doing this too well, right? That products like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram are hooking us too much, maybe causing addictions. But I still think that the real problem is not that a few companies have found ways to suck us in. The real problem is that far too many products just suck, right? That way too many things out there are just. So the real opportunity, the real problem is that still not enough people use this inside their products and services.
Got it. And for product people, this is a critical thing for us. Many of our products like this should be something that we're adopting. If we're nodding our heads and agreeing with you though, where can we start? Like what is sort of step 1 for us as product people?
Right. So I don't say this to sell more books, because I swear to God, I'm not going to say this for that reason. I don't care if you go pirate my book on somewhere on the internet where you can pirate my book. I don't really care. That doesn't matter. I already earned my advance $3 a book, so that's not the point. The point is that I wrote the book for entrepreneurs. I wrote the book for people who build product, and I know how hard it is to build the kind of product people actually want to use. So the book is a very quick read. It literally tells you what to do. At the end of every chapter, it says, here's a summary, here's what you need to know, and here's what to do next. It literally says, do this now. I made it almost like a workbook inside a general psychology type book. So it's not full of time-wasting stories. It's a very actionable book. If you can get people to read it on your team, I think it changes their minds, and it will give them the vocabulary that they need to be able to even discuss this stuff, right? Once you start talking about the deficiencies of your product using this model, right? The best thing that the book can do you, or this philosophy can do for you, is that it can help you diagnose why your product isn't engaging, right? It can tell you, oh my gosh, I don't have a good internal trigger, or the action is too difficult, or the reward isn't rewarding, or it's not variable enough, or I'm not asking for the right investment. To diagnose the problem and understand why this product isn't engaging enough is half the battle, right? You can't fix the problem unless you know what the problem is. That's the very first.
That's great. And I am a big advocate of it too. So for folks that are on here that haven't read the book, I definitely would encourage it to. Heck, again, borrow it from the library. I would encourage you to buy it too, because it's worth buying. But any way you can read it, definitely read it. I have a couple more questions, but again, just want to encourage everybody to ask their questions because we have time for a few more. But the one thing I did want to ask is, again, it has been a few years, and we talked about some new technologies that have popped up. But I'm just curious, if you're rewriting the book right now, has anything, any of those new things that popped up, has it changed? Like, is there anything you would necessarily add, or is it really like these new technologies just reinforce even more those key principles that that you put in Hooked?
Yeah, I think that the book has certainly held the test of time for the few years it's been out. I think that nothing I've seen has changed my mind about the Hook model. I think it just as much applies today, maybe more so, because the external triggers, as I mentioned earlier, the external triggers don't exist for many of the products that we're trying to form habits around. So when you think about a smartwatch app or a voice device, habits matter even more when the interface shrinks. So nothing has shown me that the model doesn't work. One thing that I didn't put in, wish I would have, that I've since kind of uncovered later on, is that some people kind of misunderstood that the variable reward phase is about gamification, and that's not true. That gamification, using points, badges, leaderboards, is a potential solution, but it's not the potential. What tends to happen with gamification when we put on points and badges and leaderboards willy-nilly without really understanding the entirety of the Hook model is that we don't scratch the user's itch. And so this is a big problem because, if the reward doesn't scratch the itch, if we don't understand first and foremost what is the internal trigger, what's the pain point, what's the uncomfortable emotion that we seek to satiate with sufficient frequency to form a habit, if we don't understand what that is, then we're just guessing, right? So, if the user seeks to be entertained, let's say the internal trigger is boredom, well, then points, badges, and leaderboards can be great because to be relieved of their boredom, for example. But let's say the internal trigger is workplace stress. Let's say it's anxiety about your money. Adding gamification is not going to work, right? So the variable